In this video I talk about the Simpsons game and has spoilers for the entire game. Some comments and images might apply to other Simpsons media and games as well. Furthermore, my frame of reference is the PlayStation 3 version, so if you played other ports of the game then some comments might not apply. But I doubt this matters too much. The Simpsons had 17 seasons by the time EA purchased the exclusive rights to develop games for the IP in 2005. For many, this was seen as an exceptional opportunity to bring The Simpsons into HD gaming with all the talent and production value that the animated institution deserved. And with the movie in concurrent development, it was go big or go home. Interviews with the development team and the creative forces of the game certainly reflected this attitude.
It's 20 years old. It's been here for that many years. People have grown up with this. We've grown up with this. As a team, we look at it and it's funny and it's fun. We don't want it to feel like you step into something, you're playing some schlocky version of an old stock game.
Prior games with the Simpsons license were pretty much all over the place. The early days featured arcade titles and minigame compilations. Then after the onset of 3D, they evolved into genre copycats, such as Simpsons Wrestling and Simpsons Road Rage.
Nothing lasts forever.
Why would you want so much inconsistency when you're one of the most recognizable brands in the world? This game, however, has the blessing from producers, the voice actors are involved, and actual writers from the show contributed to the story. On paper, it's all there. The game does offer a relatively high concept that sets it apart from a typical season. The Simpsons are in a video game. And, wait for it, the characters know it. It's one of the most self-aware Simpsons products out there. It's a closer facsimile to a Treehouse of Horror episode, non-essential but allows the writers and developers to flex their creative muscles. Unfortunately, it doesn't offer much in the way of compelling gameplay, nor is it substantially clever. So, in other words, I would describe this video as a tour of the Simpsons game's failings as both a game and an accurate representation of the show. The missions are presented in what the game calls episodes that harkens to its TV origins. The first episode begins with Homer in a dream sequence. It's just Homer, asleep on the couch. This introduction happens so fast that you might miss the detail that Homer had been eating chocolate beforehand. Nobody else in the living room says or mentions anything. There's no preamble, no setup for Homer falling asleep. If anything, this sets up a recurring theme of the game, which is to call back to one-off jokes that nobody really gave much thought to outside of their respective episodes. Upon a first playthrough, it might seem novel to recall some of your favorite jokes, but it wears off very quickly. In a typical Simpsons episode, you'd have the Simpsons engaged in an unrelated situation before the actual plot begins. I suppose the Land of Chocolate serves this purpose for the larger game. However, on its own, it doesn't really stand up. The following stage is set up by a much more fleshed out preamble than the Land of Chocolate, and establishes the central premise of the game. The Simpsons are in a video game. Again, this might have been something special if there hadn't been previous Simpsons games, but the self-reflexive premise allows for some easy gags, and the established logic of the series to be upended. The museum presents the first tag team mission, and will be how the game allows you to play from now on. To me, this works as a better tutorial section because it instructs you in all the mechanics for the entire game, not just for one character. Hot swapping, power-ups, puzzle solving, etc. are all there in the museum. This leads me to think the Land of Chocolate was a late addition to the game, hence the awkward presentation. Perhaps during playtesting, the museum stage was deemed too cumbersome as a start to the game, leading to a bad first impression. So they needed a much broader tutorial stage to get players accustomed to the controls. In the following stages, you're introduced to each character's respective powers. I'll have to give credit where credit is due, as their mechanics are creatively informed by their characters. As Homer, the player can exploit his girth to become a wrecking ball. Bart becomes the superhero Bartman with all sorts of gadgets at his disposal. Lisa's Zen powers can manipulate objects on the stage. And controlling Marge allows the player to command large crowds. Marge's powers are probably my favorite because they required me to apply strategy and engage my attention differently to allocate the townspeople as a resource. Furthermore, this taps into an aspect of her character that doesn't often get seen on the TV show. Lisa's powers, by contrast, are probably the least interesting, considering there's only so many things the game allows you to do around each Buddha statue. This is about as far as any praise for me goes, as this creative implementation of character design is undermined by the moment-to-moment gameplay. Working against the open-world design of Springfield is the level structure. Certain levels have to be completed before others, even though you can travel to any area of the map before the levels open up. If the game has missions structured along a specific path, It might as well have used an overworld screen similar to Super Mario World, for example. Walking around the map wouldn't be so bad if Springfield wasn't so devoid of content. None of the supporting characters seem like they're going anywhere or doing anything remotely related to their characters. And collectibles aren't placed in a way that make any sense. Springfield, as colorful as it is just dead. It's my understanding the PS2 and Wii ports actually lack an open world Springfield, so I'm inclined to believe that I may have preferred those versions. I don't plan on playing it again anytime soon, so I'll just have to go with my assumption for now. Speaking of collectibles, in both the overworld and each level, you can collect tokens of some kind corresponding to each playable character. To collect them, you must be controlling that character. Hot swapping would be useful in this case, but it simply isn't. The camera just warps to the other character's location instead of just switching out the characters. You might say that it would be too easy, and you'd be right. But I would have more of a problem with this proposal if it was even worthwhile to backtrack. Almost like a kick in the teeth upon finishing a stage is the end screen, which gives you a target time to complete it. Replayability is undermined with episodes that are near impossible to complete within a reasonable amount of time, because the character AI can't reliably be compensated for. In Shadow of the Colossal Donut, for example, the optimal strategy is for Homer to distract Lard Lad, while Bart gets into position to attack his weak points. But since I played this in single player, effective positioning was near impossible, as Bart would move after I placed him in position above Lard Lad, while I controlled Homer. This occurred in other stages as well, where characters needed to follow the same path to progress, which slowed things down considerably. This is an issue which I presume to be non-existent, or mitigated by the game's co-op mode. In fact, I can surmise that much of the game was designed with co-op in mind, which is a fine feature, but it turns any single-player run into an arduous task. For the sake of clarity, I did play this alone. I'll be the first to admit it would be more fair to include some aspects of cooperative play, but the larger problems of the game still apply. One type of play shouldn't be made to suffer for the sake of another. There is an over-reliance on the boring and static HUD elements to aid the player. As appealing as the game looks, it doesn't provide a lot of tools for the player to strategize or smooth out the experience. Perhaps this could be helped by a health or attack buff for the chaotic AI character. But as it is now, in order to keep anyone from dying, you have to be constantly swapping from one to another, or else they will run headfirst into danger. If you're not looking at the health bar constantly, there's no real effective method for knowing when the AI character is in trouble. Compounding these issues are enemy designs and placements. Enemies by themselves pose no real threat, and they're disposed of in relatively short time, but the game likes to compensate for this by throwing ungodly numbers of them at you. Attack patterns are repeated like clockwork, so it's really easy to get overwhelmed. The game is also so poorly optimized to handle so many enemies that compensating for them can be needlessly difficult. About midway through the game, the family seeks to free themselves from their obsolescence as video game characters, and to do so, they must retrieve key cards from 4 genre-focused episodes. Levels in the latter half of the game are certainly more high concept and specific than the previous ones. Pokemon, Zelda, EverQuest, Grand Theft Auto, Medal of Honor, and a few others all get a little bit of a send-up. These are mostly on the surface though, as the game doesn't really introduce any new mechanics to reflect the level's theming. Unique challenges include Medal of Homer's escort mission, and the battles in Happy Fun Fun game. Those stand out, but are made less valuable experiences as they're interwoven with the game's run-of-the-mill platforming and collecting. The character rosters get changed up a bit for a couple of the later stages, but I did notice certain pairings occur a lot more than others. Homer and Bart seem to get the most levels designed around their abilities more than Lisa and Marge, probably due largely to the game's action-oriented systems. I can imagine that Marge's mechanics served as more of a lower priority over the others, as the game struggles to handle so many objects in an area at a time. Pair this with the number of enemies the game likes to throw at you, and Marge becomes harder to design gameplay around. The NeverQuest stage, for example, appears to have the smallest open areas of any other levels. With the game's insistence on spectacle, you can see why she doesn't see as much action as the other family members. The final stages are by far the messiest part of the game. The gameplay just becomes even more insane as you must swap between all 4 characters instead of 2 by the end. If you thought handling 1 extra character was trouble, try 3. The boss fight with Matt Groening has its own problems, but once you get to the final boss, God, it's probably the most anticlimactic thing you can think of. A rhythm game, with an inexplicable cover of Rock You Like a Hurricane. There are plenty of game parodies up to this point, and the DDR gameplay parody makes sense with the premise, but I'm not sure what was gained from including this song when an original parody song, taking inspiration from DDR's extensive catalog, would have been more appropriate. With it being the only instance of a popular song in the game, it just feels out of place. As creative as the myriad of game parodies and gaming-centric humor is, they seem to not be implemented in consistent ways. It took me a long time to figure out how to progress in the Day of the Dolphin stage until I figured out that you had to use the Bartman grapple onto the billboard of Kratos. I love a good sign gag as much as the next fanboy, but the gameplay and level design thus far hadn't instructed me that flat objects could be grappled onto. Gameplay parody segments are relatively brief and forgiving, but they aren't well telegraphed. Going from one gameplay style to a drastically different one can be a bit surprising, even if you know what game it's in reference to. The systems established by the Simpsons game don't really lend themselves to changing the mechanics so drastically. As easy as Space Invaders is to play, for example, when you are caught off guard, it's just as easy to fail. The final boss of the NeverQuest episode was probably one of the more frustrating examples, since I discovered by accident that farting as inflated Homer was something that could cause damage. Up to that point, the game had only instructed me that it would propel Homer in different directions. The game relies far too heavily on voice lines to relay its humor.
A belt of asteroids separates the 4 inner planets from the 5 outer planets. My belt separates my gut from my junk.
The voice lines are mostly surface-level quips, and don't really explore the perspective of the characters.
Maybe you'd do better in a turn-based RPG.
I'm not afraid of you. I'm nonplussed by you.
These aliens are always taking a penny, never leaving a penny.
If this is the end, my only regret is that I wasn't more selfish.
I gotta buy my baby mama an Escalade.
I was Dick Cheney.
I hate you!
I'm sorry, but Tom Wolfe dresses like Colonel Sanders.
All the world's a stage for me to whoop your asses.
These guards will be like an amuse-bouche before we get to the main course. The smart sister built a path for the stupid brother.
I can't think of a better way to honor our brave veterans than by turning their horror into a video game.
Imagine the disappointment someone might have felt when they saw the marketing teaser for Medal of Homer and then played the game. Throughout that whole mission, not once does Homer pick up a firearm. Homer in that life or death situation is rife with opportunity, but it never comes to light at all, even when the show is full of that kind of thing. I've avoided talking about the story in depth, but that's only because there's not much to say about it. Earlier I mentioned the game calls missions episodes, yet the so-called plot of each one is paper thin, and only serves the single, larger narrative of the game. In terms of what the characters' objectives are, it's to restore Springfield to its original state and fix all the injustices they've encountered along the way. But to get to this, they confront God by the end, and the final interaction with God is probably the most convoluted things I've ever witnessed. It's a cop-out since everything presumably gets resolved so easily, but he continues on to explain that the known universe is a game of his own creation, and the game we're playing is a minigame made by his creations, which is also recursively a game being played by Ralph, who then looks at us through the screen of the television and says,
Daddy, someone's looking at me!
Now, this wouldn't be so intrusive and confusing if the self-reflexive premise stayed as more of a context for gags and not the whole of the plot itself. You get the sense that the writers kind of wrote themselves into a corner, judging by how rushed it all feels. As to the subjects and themes of the game, you would expect the most high-profile game of the Simpsons catalog to take a few punches at the games industry. The game is overtly emphatic about how sleazy the CEO of a games publisher is, and it calls attention to the oppressive work conditions of video games development. But as much heroism as the characters attempted, and as noble as their causes were, the status quo still gets maintained. That isn't to say the game needs to solve the world's problems. It can be enough for the humor to offer perspective, but any interesting ideas that get presented in the game are abandoned just as quickly as they're introduced. It's brave enough to scratch the surface, but not nearly brave enough to go for the jugular. The game almost poignantly touches upon the idea of obsolescence. Games getting lost to time through the inevitable progress of technology. The moments with the Pixel Simpsons will go at lengths to illustrate how antiquated the retro versions of themselves are, calling attention to past games in the franchise. As hardware gets more advanced, tastes and development trends change, and so must the products of their time.
And pretty soon, when there's a new, better Simpsons video game than the one you're from, I'll destroy you too.
In the time since, EA has turned their development efforts to The Simpsons tapped-out mobile game. Ironically, that can also run on weaker hardware than The Simpsons game can.
If you gotta get in the game, you gotta get with the family. Homer, Marge, Lisa, and Bart.
The Simpsons game wants to be The Simpsons game. The end-all be-all of Simpsons games. Do you like The Simpsons? This is the game you want to play. Forget everything that came before. The quality of prior games was pretty inconsistent, but when you got your hands on them, you understood what you were getting. Simpsons Wrestling was just that, a wrestling game with the Simpsons characters. At their best, they were fun what-if scenarios. What if Homer drove a taxi cab? What if Bart got his hands on a VR device? Whatever production value or brand consistency they had was beside the point. To me, this is more in spirit with the premise of Treehouse of Horror. A few little fun ideas now and again can go a lot further than a lot of big ideas at once. A high concept is fine and all, but with the Simpsons game there simply isn't much focus. It might have made sense for the powers that be to believe that they should have thrown more into the game to reflect how influential and popular The Simpsons had become by 2007. More money, gameplay, cutscenes, etc. But what happened in actuality is that the game ended up being a surface and empty representation of The Simpsons. A Simpsons fan has seen these characters, been to these settings, and heard these jokes before.
Bonjour, you cheese-eating surrender monkeys! Knock it off! We're here to protect these cheese-eating surrender monkeys!
There simply isn't much there for a longtime fan. And if you like video games, you're even more out of luck, because you'll only end up frustrated at how unpolished and unfun the game is in every sense.
That's real original.
The Simpsons game won't hesitate to interrupt gameplay to tell you how cliché it is to press a switch or blow up a barrel, as if it's going to throw you a curveball, but it doesn't dare do anything to make it more interesting. At the end of the day, the pressure switch or the barrel does its job, like in every other game before and after it. You'll play this game once and never touch it again. When looking at the game now, it makes a lot of sense that any plans for sequels or DLC were abandoned. There isn't that much they could add that would make it more worthwhile. The marketing touted the game as a defining entry, and in a sense, it was true. Not only is it The Simpsons game, but it's also the final big-budget home console game featuring the family. With how much was invested in the development of The Simpsons game, there was ample opportunity to take The Simpsons to where they hadn't gone before. It's only a shame that they're likely going to stay right where they are for the foreseeable future.